Justice Pal, Mr. Rajiv Dubey, Mr. A. Modilkar, ladies and gentlemen. I think it is an honor and a privilege to be invited to deliver the keynote address at the 138th anniversary of the Calcutta Port Trust. The Calcutta Port Trust is renowned almost throughout the world, not only for its immense size and high operational efficiency, but also for promoting social sensitivity and intellectual thinking among its members. I am very glad to note that it is paying special attention to the children of the lower staff of the Calcutta Port Trust. The topic that I have chosen for today's lecture may seem to some of you as transcendental and utopian, but I hope to convince you with a few brief arguments that the world government is not only empirically necessary in the reality of contemporary international relations, but that it is the only way to world peace, human development, and welfare. In a historical perspective, we have to note that there was no world order or international relations in the Middle Ages. The first global dimension to foreign policy was opened up by the French Revolution, when the architects of the revolution declared that it was their objective to establish liberty, equality, and fraternity all over the world. Of course, it ended in failure. And after the Napoleonic invasions in 1815, at the Congress of Vienna, the Concert of Europe was established. It was in many ways very reactionary historical development, because its main purpose was to restore the monarchies of Europe and to destroy all working class and democratic movements in Europe and elsewhere. However, there was one contribution that the Concert of Europe made to the development of the world order. It established a system of balance of power. Although the international system was imperialistic at the time, but it maintained a sort of stability for about 100 years in the international system through the strategy of balance of power and through conference diplomacy. It was an oligarchic international system, but nevertheless there was considerable conference diplomacy and to some extent the growth of international organizations like the Universal Postal Union, the Universal Telegraph Union, the International Red Cross, the Bureau of Peace, etc. Ultimately, there were the Hague peace conferences at the end of the 19th century and the early 20th century, which laid the foundations of international organization. Not yet in a quite institutionalized and crystallized form, but in an inchoate and embryonic form. Then, as you all know, after the First World War, the League of Nations was established mainly through the initiative of President Woodrow Wilson of the USA, who was disowned by the US Congress. He was defeated by one single vote. And later on, he was ridiculed for his so-called idealism by the contemporary realists who make American foreign policy. However, Woodrow Wilson succeeded in making the Charter of the League of Nations, the Covenant of the League of Nations, a part of the Treaty of Versailles. So the League of Nations came into existence. It didn't succeed, mainly because the USA didn't participate in it. The Soviet Union was not allowed to participate for a long time, and then it was briefly allowed in the 30s, but again expelled from the League. So the League of Nations failed, as we know, on account of its inability to punish deviant or recalcitrant behavior in international law, in international relations, in violation of international law. It failed to prevent the Italian invasion of Abyssinia. It failed to prevent the Japanese occupation of Manchuria. It failed to bring about disarmament, and in many other ways, it collapsed under its own weight because it remained primarily an intra-European affair. And since the powers are more or less equally balanced, it didn't succeed in maintaining international peace and order. In the interwar period, the League failed and disarmament failed, and all attempts to ensure collective security failed, and therefore this led to the Second World War. And after the Second World War, as you all know, the UN came into existence. It was established on 24th October, which is also my date of birth, and therefore it is appropriate that I should speak on the UN and its future. We know that the UN has not succeeded in every way that we can think of, but for better rather than for worse, it has succeeded in maintaining itself for a longer period than the League of Nations. I shall discuss in a moment the way in which the UN can be reformed and so on. But we know today that in spite of the existence of the UN, and in spite of its being a union of nations, most of the global problems remain unsolved. And we are today in the midst of multiple crises. And I shall briefly touch upon each of these problems of global nature which face us today. We all talk about global democracy, especially the US and West European governments claim to have geared their foreign policies to the task of establishing democracy and changing regimes everywhere which are not in their perception of a democratic nature. And this again is a sort of reappearance of the zeal of the French Revolution for changing governments on the basis of liberty, equality, and fraternity. Now, although these states which claim to be democratic today have used their democratic ideal in foreign policy in a rather selective manner, backing totally authoritarian and dictatorial regimes throughout the history of their foreign policy in many countries, and supporting democratic governments only very rarely, not even in the case of India. Their appreciation of India is a very recent phenomenon. Earlier there was always a tilt against India in favor of democratic militaristic regimes elsewhere. But in spite of this talk of global democracy as an ideal foreign policy, these so-called democratic and advanced states do not show any inclination to establish democracy throughout the world, to establish global democracy in any form whatsoever. On the other hand, they have stoutly resisted all attempts at democratizing the UN or the international system. They have been stout advocates of an oligarchic international order, which they very zealously maintain and support. In theory, they say that all human beings have the same weightage in a democracy. But in practice, they claim that those who are powerful and economically more advanced and wealthy have the right to control international relations and the world order. They do not count more than two-thirds underdeveloped states in the third world as equal participants in the international system. A few years back, I was invited to a conference in the USA on the occasion of their own independence. And I told them, you believe in your country and you have struggled to establish this ideal that black or white, rich or poor have one vote, and in law and in theory, they are equal before the state. If that is so, and if you are striving to establish that ideal in your national life, why is it that in international relations you do not advocate the same principle and you do not try to realize in practice the same ideal of equality among nations? Why should you believe that those who have greater wealth and more muscle power should dominate the international system? Is it the basic principle of democracy that those who have muscle power and wealth should control the national political system? If that is not so, why is there no international democracy? And why are you opposing any democratization of the UN Charter every time a proposal is made for that purpose? Initially they were all shocked, but later on they congratulated me. It seems that the idea didn't occur to them earlier. And there are all the famous professors and scholars assembled there. Now this is the reality, that on the one hand, the talk of global democracy even attack and destroy states like Iraq for changing a regime which they consider to be undemocratic, which was in no way involved with the terrorist attack in New York or the USA, which was in no way involved with any threat to the USA or any other country. They have destroyed that country and have kept it under imperialist occupation for years on the ground that the regime was autocratic and that they wanted a regime change in order to introduce democracy in Iraq. What about the UN and the international system? Why should only 5 nuclear states control the policies of the UN? Why should only 5 nuclear weapons powers be the only 5 permanent members of the Security Council and control the global operations of the UN? Why should not the Security Council be subordinated to the General Assembly and the General Assembly democratized in such a way that all states, rich or poor, big and small, should participate equally in a democratic world order? Therefore, while we pay lip service to the ideal of democracy, in reality, the international system is wholly oligarchic, autocratic. They say there is governance without government in the international system. It is true, but whose governance is it? Is it not public governance that is democratic or just? It is private oligarchic governance by only a few states of the world which have money power and muscle power, and that is not a democracy. Therefore, there is this basic and central contradiction between the ideal of democracy and the present structure of the international relations. Therefore, we cannot say that we have a true world order, true globalization. The economic globalization without global political democracy is bound to be oppressive, exploitative, and totally undemocratic. We are all threatened today by a global economic disaster. This is not an isolated incident. It is an integral element of economic globalization, which we hear about so much. It is true that there has been a kind of globalization in the world, at least economically. It is true that there has been an exponential growth of communication technology, that there has been a revolution in international communications, and that as a result of it, From the communication point of view at least, the world has become something like a global village. It's a cliche that is very commonly used, as you know, that we are living in a global village. But a global village is an integrated unit. In a village, everybody looks after the welfare of the others. In a village, there is a face-to-face community. In today's world, we have too many divisions, too many structures of dominance and dependency, too many systems of operation and exploitation to call it a global village. Mere quickness of communication does not make it a global village. A village may have a landlord and a landless serf, and there may be communication between them, but that does not make a global village a democratic institution. Therefore, this talk of a global village through globalization, especially economic globalization, hides the reality of the great economic disparities, inequalities, and injustices which permeate the entire economic system today. And as you know, the advanced states have very large GNPs, which are many times those of the third world states. In many cases, the multinational corporations, a single multinational corporation of the USA has a much bigger budget than many states of the third world. It was the non-aligned movement which was fighting for a new international economic order. Because without a democratic restructuring of the economic order, globalization can only mean the imposition of the will of a few wealthy and powerful states on the rest of the world who are in a great majority. The few states which control the world system today may be wealthy, may be militarily powerful, but their number is too small. And the great majority of states in the world contain also the overwhelming majority of the world population, although they may be poor and militarily weak. If we live in a democratic world, if we live in an economically globalized world which is just and equitous, then this structure has to be deconstructed and the global economic system reconstructed on the basis of democracy and justice. One example is today's global economic disaster, what they're still euphemistically calling a recession. We are actually in the midst of a deep depression, there is no doubt about it. Like the depression of the early 30s, it is a big depression, it is still rolling downhill. We have not come to the end of it. And India will also be undoubtedly very badly affected by it. It has not yet been so severely affected, mainly on account of the greater state control which we have on our economy, over banking, over insurance and other sectors of the economy. But this will not last. This has been possible on account of the opposition of some of the political forces against complete deregulation, which seems to be the ideology, that of neoliberalism, adopted by the present government. But even this will not last, because a lot of things are going to affect us. If there is an economic disaster in the USA and Europe, as seems to be the case, and they are trying to get over this disaster through state intervention, state tolls, buying banks and insurance companies and so on, with people's money, with poor people's money. The super rich who are engaged in unbridled speculation and extension of credit. And as a result of it, they are now incurring loss. And the state is coming into the picture with people's money to salvage the profits of those super rich multinational corporations. It is inherent in the structure of the economic system. Both their own system and the global system, which is being imposed by them on the rest of the world in the name of globalization. Therefore, again, you find that this is not possible through the intervention of individual states. Eventually, unless there is global coordination, and some sort of a democratic global regulation of the international economic system. It will not be possible for any single state, not even the USA, Europe and Japan together, to save the world from the present and impending disaster of the international economic system. So globalization by itself is a hollow slogan. The reality is much more difficult for the states of the world, for the poor people of the world, for the structure of the international system as a whole. There are many other problems, as you know. We are in the midst of one on account of the civil nuclear energy treaty with the USA. But there is a problem of collective security in the nuclear age. The nuclear weapons are monopolized by a few states, and in order to safeguard their monopoly, they established this nuclear non-proliferation treaty, the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty, and a few other such treaties which are called international regimes. Now, when you call it an international regime, the propaganda point or unique selling point, the USP, is that it is a democratic organization for the regulation of international affairs. There is no government, but there is governance through regimes. But here again, you will notice that only a few nuclear weapon states control the system. There are a large number of members, but none of them have no nuclear energy, no industrial capability, no future possibility of ever manufacturing nuclear weapons, but they support it. Because they were dragooned into signing this. They were through threats, through temptations, through promise of rewards made to sign this. But in reality, it is a form of bandwagoning. You have a wealthy and militarily strong superpower, so you bandwagon with it in order to be safe, in order to safeguard your sovereignty after a fashion, because your sovereignty is not yet safeguarded. So again, a few nuclear weapon states are controlling the entire international security system. And we have now, more or less unwillingly, or maybe willingly but not showing it, have become a member of these regimes. Without signing the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, we have really committed ourselves to nuclear non-proliferation. I won't go into the details of it, because there are many arguments which can be advanced against it or also for it, if you like. But the point is that there is still no global democratic regulation of international collective security. It is still a bandwagoning system. You need the support of a superpower in order to have nuclear energy, even civilian nuclear energy. And they can withdraw their support whenever they want to. And other states will not give you any nuclear fuel if that superpower asks you not to do so. The nuclear supplier group is nothing but a subordinate agency of the USA. Therefore, even in this case, you can have true collective security, not through bilateral arrangements, not through superpower compulsions, not through bandwagoning, but through collective intervention by a global democratic authority or a just and democratic world government. And with Einstein, who had been saying this throughout the war and the post-war period as long as he lived, very strongly, relentlessly, and to not only to intellectuals but to the whole world, to all the politicians, that there is no alternative to world peace and human development but a democratic and just world government. He was ridiculed afterwards by the advocates of the Cold War and so on. But to this day, I think his arguments are unanswerable. Now, as you know, there are many other problems we talk about today. One of the major problems is that of climate change and the resulting change brought about to the human environment. And the disaster which may be staring us in the face due to the melting of the Arctic ice cap, the rise of sea levels, changes in temperature, and so on. Especially in the tropical countries, the danger is greater because already our temperatures are almost unbearable in summer. And if it goes up further, then it may be intolerable. And we already have numerous diseases on account of the tropical climate. The number will increase, and even human life will be threatened in the tropics if the temperature goes up by another 2 degrees or so, which is the forecast for the next 50 years. As you know, it is due to industrialization, emission of carbon dioxide and other noxious gases, supersonic aircraft and so on. These, the carbon dioxide that is released into the atmosphere is trapped in the atmosphere. It is heated because the sun's rays come into the atmosphere in long waves and go back in short waves. They are trapped in the atmosphere, so temperature rises. And because of the rise in temperature, there is change in climate, change in the oceans, therefore change in the sea level. There are many areas of the world, including Calcutta, which will drown, which will go up the sea if there is a 7 feet rise in the sea level at the Bay of Bengal. Therefore, this is the international system. The carbon dioxide is generated mostly in the advanced industrial nations on account of their industrialization. The US is generating more carbon dioxide, releasing more carbon dioxide and other noxious gases in the atmosphere than any other country of the world. But it has not signed the Kyoto Protocol. It's not a part of the regime that is trying to bring down the level of carbon dioxide emissions. So again, there is this problem of disparity, of prominence and dependence of those who are responsible for the global warming and the climate change, totally are avoiding their own responsibility and blaming the poor countries of the third world which have not yet fully industrialized themselves for polluting the atmosphere and asking us to give up coal and other fossil fuels and to release less carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. Now here again we find for two reasons you need a global democratic authority. One is that there should be equitable distribution of responsibility and cost of change and cost of transformation into new technology. Another reason is that the emission of one country adversely affects human life in another country. It is not possible to find a national solution to the environmental problem, to climate change, to environmental degradation, and all the other issues of the environment that is threatening us today. This cannot be solved either unilaterally or bilaterally, because the effect is global, although the origin of the threat may be national. Therefore, again, this is another reason why you need a global regulatory authority. And if the global regulatory authority is democratic and just, we call it a democratic world government. Finally, there are many other such issues that I shall only mention. Another issue, there is disaster management. Tsunamis, typhoons, floods, etc. seem to be growing in number. And they are said by scientists to be connected with the problem of global warming and climate change. Whatever the reason, the fact is that these are assuming alarming proportions during the last decade or so. And today we don't have a global system like a central fire brigade office or something which can rush to any area where there is a natural disaster. Today we have a religious sort of thing, where all religions teach you not to change the social or economic system, not to change history, but they ask you to do charity to others. That as a poor man who cannot eat, he gives some money to eat. But they don't teach us how to change the social system so that nobody starves. So also in this case, you find that there is a charity, global charity system, There is a flood in Bangladesh, the US sends some blankets, France sends some medicines, India sends some wheat. It's all voluntary, optional, and in most cases very inadequate, and the form of charity for which there is no obligation. Now, the global human system cannot develop on this basis. There have been natural disasters, there will be natural disasters in future, and you cannot tackle them through charity. It is necessary to organize the world in such a manner that there is a global regulatory authority which, like a fire brigade, rushes to any endangered area and provides relief as a matter of global obligation of mankind, not as a matter of personal charity or states' voluntary charity. For this also, you need a global order that is democratic and just. And this is only the last point that I wish to mention, but as you all know, there are many other such compulsions which necessitate a forward movement of history towards a democratic and just world order. This, of course, is not a new demand or a new proposal. For the last 200 or 300 years, many thinkers and scholars of political movements have demanded the establishment of a just and democratic world government. At the end of the 18th century, Kant wrote several essays, one of which is called Perpetual Peace. And these are very famous essays written by Kant, where he proposed the establishment of a world government. But he realized that it would be very difficult at that time to induce the warring states of Europe to establish a world government to surrender their sovereignty. He therefore suggested a halfway house in the form of a union of nations, as he said, through an agreement, something like the present UN. But he said that eventually, through the teleological movement of history, there will be a world government which will be the ultimate stage of human evolution, due to the spirit of commerce, essentially, he said, that states and nations will forget their quarrels on account of the imperative necessity of global trade and commerce, because there is mutuality of interest in that field. Now, Kant, of course, could not implement what he said. And the next period of history was also a period of conflict, or what is sometimes called armed peace, etc. But in the interwar period, not only did many scholars and intellectuals write treatises justifying the movement for a world government. There are professors of Harvard University, Columbia University, in UK, in the continent, everywhere, who wrote scholarly treatises showing the reasons why the world government had become an imperative necessity. There are also political movements demanding world government both in Europe and the USA. Unfortunately, at that time, they did not think of the colonies of the Third World. They thought mostly of the white, Christian, Euro-American democratic states of their perception. But nevertheless, the idea was there. In the late 30s and 40s, even after the end of the Second World War, Einstein went on arguing in favor of the democratic world government, primarily on account of the nuclear weapons being used on Japan. It was the only time in human history that nuclear weapons were used by a nuclear state against a non-nuclear state. So Einstein was strongly against it. Incidentally, as you know, he was indirectly one of the architects of the atom bomb. But nevertheless, he also became the staunchest advocate of a world government in the 30s and 40s. In the Atlantic Monthly, he wrote a series of articles, gave many interviews, and he is well known for this. There are many other scholars, academics, intellectuals who even now have been asking for a world government. I have also in my own way written a book on world government, that is making out a case for a world government. So in this way, we find that it is not simply a transcendental, utopian, unrealizable totally futuristic sort of proposal. There is a history of human evolution, of institutionalization of international relations up to the UN. There is also a history of an intellectual movement and a political movement for world government. On account of the Cold War, it did not happen. Now the Cold War has ended. In India, as you know, there has always been profound thinking on the need for a world government. Nehru, while justifying India's membership of the UN, had incessantly talked of the need for one world and one world government. Sri Aurobindo is probably the greatest intellectual and philosopher who wrote extensively on the need for a world government, primarily in two books. One is called The Human Cycle and the other is called The Ideal of Human Unity. And especially in The Ideal of Human Unity, he argued that the empirical movement of history, the teleological unfolding of history, will one day inevitably lead to the establishment of a world government. That the contemporary tendencies of centralization in international relations, including economic, administrative, and political centralization, indicate the inevitable tendency towards the establishment of a world government. He said, however, that it is possible that humanity will learn the lesson only out of necessity, not due to idealism. He himself believed in the descent of the supermind and so on, and the supermind will create a new consciousness. That is a field of study into which social scientists cannot enter. But at least he said that one day, maybe out of necessity, they will do it, if not voluntarily or due to idealism. The last question which I want to place before you is, are we as Indians, or is the state in India following that path? At one time, India was leading the non-aligned movement, demanding a new international economic order, a new international political order, a reform of the UN Charter in order to make the UN more democratic. And it was preaching an ideology which was between the two contending ideologies. It was maintaining a distance from the superpowers, especially from the military alliances headed by the West. Today we find a complete reversal of that foreign policy orientation. We find not only that India has strategically aligned itself with the only superpower which is in existence and which is militarily wealthy, which is militarily powerful and economically wealthy, and has been oppressing and terrorizing the rest of the world for many years. Can the leader of the non-aligned movement form a strategic alliance with a state which for no logical reason whatsoever has destroyed the old civilization of Iraq and has been occupying it for the last 4 years or so, without any violation of international law, any international delinquency on the part of Iraq? Is our democracy or global outlook so bereft of ideas and morality that we should make such a total about time in our foreign policy? Moreover, we had always been demanding, along with other third world states, as the leader of the non-aligned movement, democratization of the UN, restructuring of the international economic and political system. We are opposing military alliances. We are demanding complete nuclear disarmament. One of the reasons why we didn't sign the nuclear non-proliferation treaty is that it is discriminatory, that the nuclear powers should disarm themselves, that our policy is that of total nuclear disarmament. And today we are trying to become the sixth oligarch in an oligarchic international system, militarily and economically, where the 5 founding oligarchs govern the international system privately without a democratic government. It may be said that all this is practical necessity, that you cannot ignore the reality. I do not wish to ignore the reality. Tomorrow is founded on today's reality. It is said that that yesterday is history, and tomorrow is a mystery, and today is a gift, and that's why it is called the present. I don't know about that, but all I know is that today is built upon yesterday, and tomorrow is built upon today. Because today's reality is unwholesome, there is no reason why we should remain fully satisfied, wallowing in this reality which is full of conflict and contradiction. Today's reality has to be the basis for building tomorrow's ideal. But it is not necessary to remain engrossed in today's reality. It is not the goal of human life. In individual life, so also national life, we must hitch our wagon to a star, not to the given reality.